Welcome to configuring your Blackmagic SMPTE 2110 converters. And this is going to be a series on SMPTE 2110 and Blackmagic specifically. And I just wanted to give sort of an understanding of how you configure these, as some of the other videos are going to delve into some real specific details. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I have here on the desk. So first off, I have a mini IP to HDMI. Now this is essentially a HDMI out with a Ethernet. And again, when we talk about SMPTE and Blackmagic devices, I want to note that it's important to think that these are 10 gig. So if you're routing them through a switch, you need to have a 10 gig switch. And again, we'll talk about that in some of the other episodes. But just keep that in mind, that you can't just plug this into your standard 1 gig, or if you are from the past a little bit more, the 10, 100, 1000, which 1000 is 1 gig. It just doesn't work. And also we'll talk about VLANs, separation. Again, those are going to be in a separate episode, but this is specifically to note that you can't just plug these in to any sort of standard switch. Okay, so back to what we have on the desk. So again, we have the IAP to HDMI, as well as a 3x3 SDI HD. Now this one is capable of HD only, but the key is you actually have 3 in as well as 3 out. There's also a reference in here, right here, and we'll talk about that again in another episode. And you also have this really great loop in, loop out. Actually, I should probably put it this way. There we go. That's better. So what we have now is a loop in, the SDI in right here, which loops to these right here, as well as these out. Again, you will notice this says 10 gig Ethernet PoE. Now, PoE is one of those great things that we'll talk about in, again, I keep prefacing all these later episodes, but I will create a playlist for all 3, possibly 4 of these. PoE makes this whole networking thing really nice. So let's go ahead and start first off with the IP to HDMI. Again, that is a 10 gig. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take, a UHD. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our USB and we're going to plug it into the USB port here. I went ahead and this is plugged in, and we've plugged in the USB. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at what it comes up as in Converter Setup. And Converter Setup is the program you're going to want to use. Let's go ahead and now look at the Converter Setup. I get my mouse moving here. And if I go over, I do have in this actually is in a Atom equipment rack, so or an Atom rack that has an Atom and then some other converters that are plugged in. So that's why that's coming up. But you will see, here's the Blackmagic 2110 IP, mini IP to HDMI. That's a mouthful. And what you'll do is you'll click on this little button right here. That will bring up a dialog with all your configuration in it. So let's go ahead and go full screen on that. So the first thing to note is if you have not updated these, it's important to actually do the update. There's actually been some very specific timing issues that have been done in the last few months. This is releasing in February of 2026. I believe those were done in November or October of last year. Actually, I think it was October, maybe even been late September. So it's important to note. Now, a few things. So protocol, I'm just going to go down this really quick. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set this. I would always, and this has to do with SMPTE 2110 as a whole. It's way easier if you actually uniquely label each of your devices. So again, I'm on this one, which you can see actually says BM 2110 HDMI 4. What I'm going to do is I'm going to label this 2110 HDMI 4, and I'm going to hit set. By doing that on SMPTE, it'll actually allow us to actually see the box a lot easier once we actually have it plugged into a network. So again, always name your devices, and I would recommend also putting a label on them with which one it is. The last thing you want to do in the field is to have to try to figure this all out. And by labeling it and that label matching what the actual box is, it makes this whole process a lot easier. Okay, so let's pop back into here. So you can see it says 2110 HDMI 4. Now, I'm going to go down a little bit, and you can actually see this. It says DHCP versus static. So the key here is that you have to understand your network, and that's another episode, which we won't talk about. But I actually have everything on a static. Again, when you get to video over IP, it starts getting easier when you actually have static IPs. For right now, I'm going to leave it as a DHCP, but that is important to actually be able to configure everything and know which box is actually at a physical address. That is very much for a later episode, but I wanted to preface by saying I don't want to do this yet until I actually have a complete list of all of my devices and what their IPs are. That's important because in the long term, you actually need to know what every IP is for all of your 2110. It's just a lot easier if everything's on a static when it comes to this 2110 protocol. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look here again. So I'm going to leave this as DHCP for the time being. Now, allow utility administration via USB and Ethernet versus USB. Now, this basically boils down to a choice from what you want as an admin and what you want from a security purpose. If you only have it as USB, the challenge will be that you only can have control when the USB is plugged into it, which means that you are going to have to plug that physical USB in the field every time you want to change it with a laptop. That's why I check USB and Ethernet. So that is one of those that I find that it's just easier in the long scheme of things. Now, HDMI output, this is kind of one of those your choice. Mileage may vary. I kind of like to leave it at normal levels just because then my blacks aren't super crushed. Audio, I typically don't use these with audio, so I will actually just leave it as the SMPTE standard. And then consumer, what that does is that just is more of a standard 5.1 versus 5.1 surround processor versus a sort of a SMPTE standard that would be used for movie theaters and some different things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and save here just because I want to save those with settings. Now, let's jump back in, and I only hit save because I kind of wanted to make sure that these were set. So 2110 HDMI 4, again, DHCP, USB and Ethernet, and then normal levels. Now, let's go over to 2110 tab. We are going to leave this for right now as what it is. We'll come back and I'll show you how this works. But the one thing I want to encourage everyone to do, and I'm going to go into PTP in another episode, but the one thing I'm going to do that's incredibly important is I'm going to actually click this follower only. Why this is important? Well, come to find out, PTP is an extremely important thing within 2110. And again, PTP, Precision Time Protocol. That's what PTP stands for. And we'll talk about that in another episode, but that's incredibly important. And in a Blackmagic environment, you actually should only have one non-follower and everything else should be a follower. And what will happen is currently you can't see it, but you'll actually then end up seeing a master when we have this configured. And again, I would strongly recommend all converters except for one with this PTP follower. And then LUT, pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, if you wanted a LUT, you can import one and it can be on the box permanently. You can have some fun with that. That's more for people that may be doing some film sets or that sort of thing that need to have LUT, which is a lookup table. Okay, so don't worry about the NMOS registry. Again, this is a function of something that's way more for people that are Using this in a larger deployment, NMOS becomes important. But for us, when we're just using it on a very small basis, it doesn't really matter that much. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pop over to this camera, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that USB out, and I'm going to go ahead and plug that into. So this, it's kind of hard to see, but let me autofocus this. You can see it actually is showing that it's basically in its startup set. I'm just going to go ahead and set that just so that it's not, flashing like that. And I'm going to go ahead and plug this USB cable in here. So let's go back over to the converter setup. And now in this time, it actually put it back that direction. And again, 2110 IP video converter 3x3G. Now, clicking on that, inputs, right now, we're not going to worry about labeling. Outputs, again, we don't need to worry about labeling. Setup. Remember, we talked about this before, and what I will do is you can take a look at this box, BM 3x3G number 3. This is the third one that I have. I did a system reset for all of you folks. So we're going to go ahead and call this, I'm going to go BM 3x3 G number 3. DHCP via USB and Ethernet. Now, you'll also notice there's a reference output here. What does that mean? Well, reference is one of those things that I'm going to talk about with PTP, again, another episode. But it's important to think about from a standpoint of what do you shoot in? Now, us as a production company, we use 2997, 1080p. You could use 30, you could use 60, you could use 5994. That is a standard that I'm not going to get into discussion on why you should do one or another. Feel free to do what you feel you need to do. But the key will be that you need to set this output standard to what you use. And in this case, we'll use 2997. And I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Again, I just want to save it. I'm going to save it so that essentially what can happen is I'm going to make sure that we are ready to go with those settings before I move on. Sometimes Blackmagic can get a little weird, and so I just have found that sometimes saving things like that is that much easier. All right, so we're going to go back in here. Now, we're going to go across to the 2110. Now, you will remember I talked about that PTP follower versus essentially what it should be. Now, again, follower versus master, okay? So master is essentially going to be the one device in your architecture that you want to be essentially the conductor. It's always going to be that. Now, in this case, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and this is going to be unchecked because, again, I want this to be the conductor. I want this to be the master times signature that is basically set down. There's a bunch of stuff at the bottom down here that we don't need to really worry about. Again, NMOS. And then 2110 audio, again, it's capable of carrying a lot of things. I would say for 90% of the people out there, you're not going to worry about it. The only thing that you may want to do is just do a couple of channels, but you're not going to need to worry about that. So, set up, ready to go. I am going to do a video on networking, but I want to show you how this works in a real world. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and unplug this. Now, I'm going to go ahead and also on this table is a Unify. This is a Pro XG 8 PoE. And you can see, let me do a focus real quick. You can see the ports on it. There's 8 PoE. Now, this isn't a VLAN situation. Again, networking. I don't want to go too much. Know that if you're going to, you can, let me just tell you this. I can actually plug, let me go, I can plug that PoE or that Ethernet right there to that Ethernet if I wanted to. and I can have data between the two. The thing about 2110 though is that we can create these huge structures. So what does that look like? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come over here to 2. So you can actually see there's actually another, there's an actual whole other, this is number 1 that is configured. And I'm going to go ahead and activate that just so we can kind of see what it looks like. Before I do that, I'm going to go back because the issue becomes, remember again, we talked about this follower versus, you know, the master conductor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and plug my USB back in. So I'm going to come back over to the converter program, and you can notice this is 2110 IP video converter, because what I didn't do is actually set the name. So under setup, I hit save, but again, these are the weird things that sometimes Blackmagic does that I understand why they're doing it, but at the same time, sometimes you have to go back, oh yeah, that's why we had to do that. So let's look, and I'm sure that a lot of you saw what I did, but we're gonna call BM 3x3G, this is gonna be number 3. Now, what I forgot to do before was hit set. Yes, I forgot to hit set. All right, but in this case, since we're in here, I wanna go ahead and make this a follower. The reason why is because this little box right here is actually the master conductor. And so I am actually going to now plug in, because again, this has PoE. So I'm going to take this and we're going to, it's hard to do upside down and backwards, plug that in. So give it a few more seconds here. I may have to, unfortunately, sometimes you have to quit the converter actually program and then come back in order for it to get it. But in this case, it actually was capable of actually seeing it. And so let's go ahead and bring that full screen. And what we're going to see is, there's number 3 and there's number 1. And number 1 actually has in 2110, and you can see that it is not follower. And you can tell and you can see that this is master. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and plug in these other 2. And this is the beauty of 2110, because what I can do, let's go ahead and plug these 2 in. So again, you can see that they now have an Ethernet in this one, and they have an Ethernet in this one. And again, this may take a couple of seconds. I'm going to go ahead and just wait for this program to fire up. So because we said USB and Ethernet, when we go into the program, you will actually see now there's number 3 as well as the 4, as well as that number 1 that I had 2. So why don't we go ahead and now, looking at box number 1, I'm going to go ahead and label these. So I actually have a feed coming from a clock. This is going to be output 2 of the atom, and this is going to be output 3 of the atom. Well, let's put a space in there. Okay, so what we can do now is let's go ahead and take a look at, again, this is that box 4. So it's this one right here. And I'm going to go ahead and change this. And unfortunately, I don't have a monitor hooked up to it. But what you can do is you can see on 2110, I now have the ability to say, I want the clock coming out of that. And here is literally the most beautiful thing about SMPTE 2110, which is that I now have the ability to literally route any in to any out, any in to any out. And so it's exposed in the network. And in this case, you can see clock. And because we have both of those boxes, I can even grab any of the other inputs from the other box, or, you know, this box basically right here is also there. What this does is it allows for essentially a master, you know, router, if you want to look at it that way. Any in can go to any out, or you can take one in and send it to all outs. A good example of one thing that I did not too long ago, we're very much a Blackmagic ecosystem. So I wanted to send down to cameras that were actually going through the SMPTE latency. We'll talk about that in another episode. But I wanted to send one input to all of the, essentially the 3 outputs that were on one of these 3x3s somewhere. And that's how I did it. I just hooked up one to one of these, essentially. So this is like number 1, and then was able to send that to the other box. So this is the other box, and I had basically output. It's kind of hard to see, but here's the outputs. Oh, go this way. So here's the outputs right here, 1, 2, and 3, and I was able to send that to all 3 of those outputs. So I hope this helps. I hope this kind of gives you an understanding of what you can at least start with. Again, the key takeaways are: 1, always, always, always label those number 1. 2, decide whether you're going to do DHCP or static. If you're going to do static, make sure you have a master map with the device name as well as the IP address that's going to be in there. And 3rd, always remember the follower should be checked on all devices except for 1. And in the case of me, this box right here is essentially the master conductor, my master, and I'll talk about that in the next episode or one of the other episodes, called PTP. Critically important when it comes to essentially what is the standard for all SMPTE 2110. Deep dive, shallow, deep. I hope you got something. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're looking for. I am going to be doing a very deep dive with SMPTE 2110 over the next several episodes. Feel like Blackmagic is at a sweet spot. And the Super Bowl, you know, Super Bowl 60 had basically NEP, which is a very large broadcast truck manufacturer. It was a SMPTE, completely a SMPTE 2110 production. Very different than in years past. We're watching things like the Olympics, other things in SMPTE 2110 now, and SMPTE 2110, because of Blackmagic, has come to a relatively accessible market for people like us, in that sort of the professional, yet we don't want to have the sizable infrastructure and expense of the large broadcasters. Hope this helped. Again, leave a comment. Thanks. Have a great day.